Okay. Most, if not all of us, have been dealing with transitions. And transitions are related to something fundamental, which is institutional system, my lifelong interest, with a short break for monetary and fiscal policies, both in practice and in theory. But even with respect to these topics, I was looking for the institutional underpinnings of these policies, like independent central bank or how to limit excessive spending. Institutional systems, at least with respect to economy, are dealing with the longer run. They do not neglect short run, but mostly in the longer run. And against this background, I'd like to notice an unholy alliance between short-termism, which is inherent in politics, and economics, which focuses on the demand. This is an unholy alliance, which we are witnessing for the last at least 30 years. I can only say that it is even more important to look at something more fundamental. And I think there are three issues related to the topic of institutional systems. First, what is it? I'm going to analyze at the country level. Second, which is the main topic, the relationship between differences or changes in these systems and various measures of the quality of life, which is fundamental. And third, dynamics, a huge topic. I try to be brief so as to leave some time for the discussion. On the first issue, what makes a collection of institutions at the country level a system, which means it can last, not quality of performance. Bad system can last, and unfortunately they have lasted. A good system can be eroded from within by various interest groups. So if you happen to have a good system, you have to defend it. It is not going to defend itself by its quality. Now, this is the first point. The second point is that in the history of what is usually called thought, we have various utopias. And the worst utopias were very popular. The worst utopia was Marxist. I remember the hopes and what were the promises? Freedom and welfare. And one should be shocked. And this sort of shameless utopia has been so popular throughout history and continues to be popular. This is against the basics of rational thought. And the second related utopia is about combining socialism and democracy. When I say socialism, I mean what Marx have thought about it, anti-capitalism, no private ownership. By the way, demonization of private ownership is unbelievably false and still remains influential, which only suggests that this has to be defended too. And we should brand what I call totalitarian humanists. Those who are attacking capitalism and democracy and advocating Soviet model, like Sartre and other prominent French totalitarian humanists. I remember Jean Robinson visiting Poland in the 70s. He was wearing the Maoist dress, and he was a Maoist. I think there were many more proponents of Marxism in the West than in those countries which were plagued by Marxism. So the topic is absolutely essential because bad system may be popular when you are still free. Then you may lose it. I'm not speaking only about Poland. I will mention Poland in a way, but let me now come to the main topic, which is the relationship between institutional system and the quality of life or performance of the system. First, we know that's a hugely important topic because there are huge differences in the various measures of quality of life between countries of the same historical background, North and South Korea, East and West Germany, or similar backgrounds like Poland and Spain. So it's hugely important, and I think throughout history of modern economics, neglected. I remember one of the recent Samuel Wilson textbooks, when I think it was the beginning of the 80s, when he was predicting when Soviet Union would overtake United States. Can you imagine that? And this was after all the information regarding atrocities and backwardness of this union of the USSR was available. Okay, now there are various approaches to formalizing the quality of life. One can try, following Buchanan, to try to devise a procedure whereby people voting with their own feet, etc., would decide about the ranking of the quality of life. But this is pretty difficult. I will follow other methods, and I will just name 5 performance indicators. They can be measured, and they are measured. Now it's the growth of economic standard of living. The second is extent of individual liberty. Liberty is not only an instrumental variable. It is important as a very essential component of the overall quality of life. And you know it when you make a transition from an oppressive regime to non-oppressive regime. Third is extent of fear between the government or the rulers and those who are ruled. Again, it is related to the extent of freedom, but it matters on its own. The fourth would be the types and magnitudes of inequality in a society. And here we have such a disarray in the public discussions that it is worth commenting. And the fifth would be possibilities of professional self-realization. Under some regimes, they are limited. Under other regimes, they are not. Now, I know that is a huge subject, so I have to be very brief again. And I am not going to present you with an extended typology of institutional systems. But let me only say that the basic distinction between socialism and capitalism still matters. Based on whether private ownership is banned or allowed, we know that socialism had to be very homogeneous, so there was no large variety. But capitalism is diverse, and it was distinguished at least something which is very rare nowadays, which would be free market capitalism, overregulated and fiscally stretched, and crony capitalism, like in the Soviet Russia. Certainly the third is the worst from various points of view. And there is a lot of research, including data to OECD, which deals with problems of overregulated and fiscally overstretched capitalism. So we can touch upon that under the discussion. But let me remember you that one basic point. Socialism cannot be democratic. Socialism has to be dictatorial. Capitalism is necessary, even though not sufficient conditions for democracy. So if you dislike capitalism for some strange reason, love it if you love democracy. And defend the foundation for democracy. Now, to cut a very, I leave such terrible regime like Talibs. I focus on, say, Western sphere. And we can say, based on empirical data, that by far the worst regime was the one which has been very popular, which is socialism. On all the counts. Backwardness, very slow economic growth, huge inequalities in power, third, intimidation, and limiting the possibility for self-realization, In every society, some people want to be independent artists, entrepreneurs. This is banned under this the most modern and progressive system. Now, let me touch briefly upon a very important link between the type of the institutional system and longer-term economic growth. It's also a huge research. And I would like to mention that until recently, until even now, so-called growth theories in the West were anti-institutional. So they were not considering the most important factor. And we look at the beginnings of these theories in the 30s, they fitted Soviet Union. Harold Domar, and only later they were a bit relaxed. And this was this 20th century. So it shows you unbelievable neglect in mainstream economics of the most important factors. Now, I found it useful analytically in discussing economic growth to distinguish two kinds of factors, both related to institutions. First, I call it systematic. By definition, those who last for a long time, or perhaps forever, even though with declining intensity. And second one are growth breakdowns, in other words, crisis. Now, on the first systematic forces, there's a lot of research. And I don't know any serious papers who would say there's too much economic freedom in the West. Do you? No? Anybody? Anything? Most well-founded research points out to various limitations to economic freedom, including especially labor markets, regulations, including the financial regulations, too. So this is empirical proof one has to defend economic freedom. Second, growth breakdowns. There is a cliche in the textbooks that crises are due to market forces. So this is a plague of capitalism. And this is flagrantly false. Because the worst crises have happened under non-market systems. China, at the moment. The worst threat of a serious crisis is not economic freedom. It is a concentration of political power. And we know this. Also in Poland, a mild crisis after Gierek. But this is disregarded. But even if you look at the crisis in the West, you see that in most, if not all cases, as a very important reason for the growth breakdown, you have wrong state interventions, including the Great Crisis in the United States in the 30s, or in Spain, banking crisis, cajas, state-owned banks, in Slovenia, state-owned banks, etc., etc. So this cliche, which is being taught in the textbooks, is flagrantly false. But since it's taught, it's popular. So it has to be counteracted if you want to have a bit safer society from the point of view of the economy. I will skip something which I think is very interesting, which is a comparison of India and China. I only say that you may find a very imperfect democracy like India with worse policies than China. Both have bad, but India's policies on the economic growth are even worse than China. But this does not prove that socialism is better than capitalism, because both are imperfectly capitalistic. Now, let me mention something which belongs to these performance criteria, which are inequalities. There is an obsession, popular obsession with inequality of income, to the disregard of the by far most important inequalities. Why there is an obsession? I call it obsession, inequality, because first, in these debates, there is not enough distinction between inequalities due to chronic capitalism, which are unjust, and this is one of the reasons why chronic capitalism should be abolished, and inequalities due to entrepreneurial activities, like Steve Jobs, etc. And secondly, what is the optimal income inequality? It cannot be defined. This is why this is unending discussions. To the disregard of inequality of opportunity, which is extremely important, because lowering this inequality is good from the point of view of elementary justice, and it's good for the economy, for economic growth. And here, if we disregard the impact of family, we can say the optimal inequality of opportunity is zero. But we cannot disregard the impact of family, so it's a little more than zero. And what is also disregarded in these discussions about inequality are the huge inequalities of power, which are huge present in dictatorships. So somehow dictatorships, if the lower income inequality, are good. Okay, and let me finish with a brief look at the dynamics of institutional system, which is a huge subject, as you know, dealt by historians, sociologists, to some extent, economists. So I would like to make only 2 or 3 remarks. First, from time to time in history, you have very good surprises. And we had such a surprise. Nobody, or almost nobody, even in 1989, not myself, in the first half, expected that Poland would become free. And we should appreciate this freedom very much. This was related, as we know, to the dissolution of Soviet Union, something which we should be grateful for Gorbachev, even though the Russians are not so grateful. Certainly he did not intend it, but he did not intervene when he still could. So it should be appreciated. One of the puzzles related to the dissolution of world socialism, communism, is this. Why China has started going away from socialism in the economic sense in the late 70s, while the Soviet Union started only 10 years later. I don't know the answers. One has to dig deeply into the historical circumstances, personalities, etc. But this had huge consequences for history. And another point, and this is the last point, is this. If you have democracy, then compared to the alternative political system is worth defending. But we know that under lasting democracies, the main attack comes on the economic freedom. Not on the fortunate freedom of speech, not the freedom of association, not the freedom of the media, and the freedom of economic freedom. And I don't know whether it's less or more than, say, 50 years ago. And this should be a very important question, why? And then, of course, how to defend it, because economic freedom is at the same time fundamentally important and very much attacked. And it's fundamentally important because, as we know from massive economic research, reducing economic freedom through regulation or excessive public spending tends to reduce economic growth, and that it produces a lot of dissatisfaction. And second, if you reduce economic freedom between certain threshold, democracy is under threat. So two important reasons. And this is something for the think tanks and the media, and the think tanks and the media. But we know from a recent experience of Hungary and Poland that could be worse attacks. In Poland, we have an attack on the economic freedom via nationalizations, excessive regulations, excessive spending. But what distinguishes Poland during the last 6 years is the attack on the fundamentals of political system, which is division of powers, which is related and called independence of the legal system, judicial system, etc., etc. I am not mentioning this just to have a discussion on that, but I can like to end with saying that I think this is, for Polish people, the most fundamental thing. Even not so much defending economic freedom, even though it's important for economy, defending the rule of law. And I think we can manage it if less people would complain and more people would act. At acting nowadays in Poland, there is no risk. One has only to know that something depends on her or him. This is the final accord. Sorry for ending on such a Polonocentric note, but I wanted to use this opportunity. Thank you very much. I saved 22 minutes. Yes. That's it? Okay. So I stay here.
Can I take the mic?
Oh.
Thank you, Anders Åström. I would like to follow up here. Since 2005, Freedom House has reported that democracy has declined every year systematically. And how would you put this together? What is the fundamental problem that we are seeing? Is it too much inequality so people are reacting against that? Or is it too much crony capitalism that gives the rulers more power so that they can buy up the votes? Or is it some other form of corruption? Where do you see the main problems that is driving this big move from democracy?
Well, I think it is not uniform. So you have some pockets of countries when measures of democracy have declined, but not all countries, to my knowledge. And then one would have to look at these specific countries, which I did not. So I will offer you my speculations. And for example, in Central America, there's a visible decline. There are more and more pseudo-democracies. And I wonder why. Perhaps less educated electorate, more aggressive interest groups, leaders who are elected who do not care about political freedom. This is my speculations. I think I know more about Poland. This did not need to happen, but it happened. You know, there are few unpleasant surprises. Because first, even Kaczynski, I don't think he was dreamed that he would win presidency and parliament. Election campaign matters. And we had a very bad election campaign on the part of a decent fellow, the former president. So professionalism matters. everywhere, including politics, especially democratic politics. And then peace had a very good luck. Two parties, leftist parties, have went separately into the elections, and they have lost. In this way, they contributed to the victory in the parliament. This has happened. This does not need to happen. I'm not saying that this was not democracy. Democracy sometimes brings about better results if one of the opponents is not very professional, and that's it. Later, once Kaczynski realized that he has a life chance, he decided to go to the maximum. What does that mean, maximum? He went much further than any government, any in Poland before. Compared to him, what is called post-communists are ideal liberal, ideal Democrats. They never attacked the fundamentals of the rule of law and division of powers. Well, he did it. Initially, he had a very good luck again because economy accelerated due to the external factors. So there was more money to spend on his electorate. Plus something which was, again, never so flagrantly present, very aggressive propaganda due to the captured TV. No governments before did a demonization. And if you take this together, you probably can explain why until now they have not lost more than some 5 or 10%, but they can lose. I don't think it is hopeless case. Only what is needed is that every person should think, what can I do more besides complaining? And what does it mean? Not necessarily risking. There's no need to risk prison or life. There is need to support some selected think tanks, especially those who defend fundamentals of democracy and the rule of law. Okay?
As you know, US President Ronald Reagan famously said that freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. I think we've seen how tenuous economic freedom is given the COVID-19 pandemic, given that we can have prohibitions on economic activity, which been in liberal democracies, which are switched on and off and on and off, and moves towards some form of cronyism. You are allowed to open your business. You are not allowed to open your business. We changed the rules again. Rule of law, shifting. Rule of law for me, not for thee. In the post-COVID-19 world, what do you see as the prospects for economic freedom? And is there a constituency for it like there was 30 years ago?
I am not in the business of forecasting, especially pessimistic forecasts. There are too many specialists in that. Unless you can prove that the future is hopeless, act. You cannot prove the future is hopeless, act. So this is my first response. On the second, I don't. I understand this confusion related to pandemic, but I would not blame very much the various governments. I don't have much sympathy to those who confuse freedom with being against these injections. This is a false concept, I think, of freedom. I think these dangers which we all see with respect to especially economic freedom are not dated from 2 years ago. They've been present much earlier. The reasons are more or less well investigated. In the West, there are interest groups, not only commercial, which have been analyzed by Mankul also. I think there are more and more in ideological interest groups. And if you have a pressure upon something you value, act to the public opinion. That's it. And be effective, which we try. Yes.
Marek Dąbrowski. I have one question and one comment. Question follows Anders' question. What is the role of revolution in information communication technologies which destroy traditional media and traditional public debate, and to some extent also the system of political parties in many countries in challenging liberal democracy and spreading populism. And comment relates to the fragment when you mention, you try compare China and Soviet Union, why China managed to start market reform under communist rule and Soviet Union didn't. My understanding is that apart from, of course, personalities, which also play a great role here, the China situation was completely, socioeconomic situation was completely different from Soviet. This was very nicely described in the well-known paper of Jeffrey Sachs and Wing-Te Wu several years ago, that China was largely rural economy after all these Maoist experiments on the verge of extinction. And basically, it was enough to give a certain degree, not very much economic freedom to farmers, allow to create small private enterprise. It gave a big boost. In case of over-industrialized Soviet economy, any attempt of market reform would require deindustrialization first, as it happened in 1990s actually in former Soviet Union. And this, of course, met a huge political resistance and etc. Thank you.
Well, it sounds like on the second, but still the question is why Cuba still remains communist, not to mention North Korea. And I'm not responding, expecting any question for you, Marek. I think just as puzzles, historical puzzles. On social media, look, I am reading various analyses which point out usually to negative consequences of more possibilities to spread false news. Okay, what is my response? I am being very active on Twitter, and I have 360,000 followers, and on Facebook, and that's it. Try to do it if you see a danger, and you are not assuming that already everything is decided. Act. That's it. I can, of course, discuss these learned analysis of the impact of the social media, but I don't think it's very useful. Yes. Oh.
Józef Niżnik. I found very interesting what you said about conditions that lead to the crisis. And it certainly sounds like a very bad prognosis for our current situation, economic situation in Poland. But then I tried to locate in this interpretation the crisis of 2008, which was a financial crisis. Could you explain how does it fit to this kind of thesis?
From what I remember, there's a lot of empirical research, certainly on Europe. In Europe, you have Spain, and the crisis in the Spanish sector was concentrated in the non-private segment, which are Cajas. Santander, a private bank, has not suffered very much. In the US, you have Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which are not exactly ideal private enterprises, and they contributed to the crisis, plus something which many people recognize even at the time of excessively low interest rates. It has led to to the crisis. So I think there is quite a lot of empirical research which would falsify this widespread cliche that whenever there's a crisis, it is due to access to the market forces. We had a lot of empirical research which gives at least a fruit for thought. There are no statists here. Nobody would object.
Participants, we have a question from Mr. Paul Hare. This is the question. Rule of law, commonly thought to be vital part of well-functioning market-type economy, but often poorly understood. How can we strengthen this aspect of the economic mechanism in Poland these days?
So let me start first with the definition. I think it largely overlaps with the division of powers in the state. We know from Montesquieu that, as you said, division between legislative and executive, and then between these two and judicial. But in fact, what really matters is a separation and independence of judicial and prosecutors' power from the two. Because in practice, in democracies, from time to time, you have a government who has a majority in the parliament and creates the executive power. And in Poland, what has been under attack, it's exactly this judicial prosecution. And what has been happening in Poland since 2015 is by far the worst compared to the previous periods after 89. And then there's an attempt which is not fully successful, fortunately, to control the judges. You know, that they resist, rightly so. The strong legal organization of the judges who defend the independence of the courts. And this is very important. Okay. Yes.
So on your statement concerning the optimal level of inequality. So I mean I'm not an expert in analysis of inequality, but I was wondering to what extent this statement is, so to say, in violation with the functioning of a democratic process, right? So I mean, we could think that excessive, however you measure excessive inequality, will to some extent determine through the political process, the political economy of, let's say, the public policy or tax policy, other economic policies. So to what extent through these channels, in fact, you might have excessive inequality leading to unfavorable political outcomes, which you can see everywhere, in fact.
The point is you have to define excessive in the intersubjective way. You can define it if you deal with inequality of opportunity. You can define in the subjective way that the smaller it is, the more approach zero, the better. And we can, because it's both just and it is also helping the development of the economy and society. I don't know how can one define excessive without in the intersubjective way, not just I think it is. I add something which I already said, that one should, of course, make a distinction between wealth acquired through monopoly powers, crony capitalism, and wealth acquired through entrepreneurship. And I think the best solution to the first is try to remove are not allowed to have crony capitalism. Otherwise, we are arbitrary. Yeah? Yes. And to be sure, I am not defending these rich people. I am trying to have, clear criteria, not arbitrary criteria. Just not criteria. Yes.
Mieczysław Groszek. First of all, I would like to congratulate CASE 30 years of existence, and as an institution, is as a really very good example for Polish post-transition period, because not so many survived under the same name, even like CASE did. And coming to the subject of your lecture, Professor Balcerowicz, I would like ask you where is the mechanism? Why is so easy to make a relatively well-functioning institutional system, like what we had 6 years ago at least, to very bad system what we have now? Why is so easy to change this from good quality? Maybe the institutional system that time, so 6 years ago, was not so strong, not enough sustainable. But it is really this comparison is very pessimistic, and I couldn't believe that it can happen in such a society with such a good background of the economic reform. You laid the foundation for this years ago, and suddenly we have a different, other, I would say, a virtual reality what we are forced to live.
Well, on the 2 points first, I am not going to do it, but it's very easy to mention countries which used to be much more civilized than Poland and went into a terrible transition. Germany, before the war. This is not a consolation, but just point of reference that from time to time, if there is a special combination of circumstances and you have people without scruples, so you have to have these two, you may have a drastic change. And secondly, with respect to Poland, I cannot add more than I said. Why that can I repeat that in my mind, the victory of peace was not something which could not be avoided. You know what is bad for people? When bad guys have good luck. And it happens from time to time. And the whole response is later. It's no point in wasting time in analyzing why did they win power. The whole point is to organize so that they lose power. And that's possible. Well.